Okay, so, Bitcoin and the whole crypto world has been pretty wild lately, right?
Yeah, definitely seen some big swings.
And for a lot of people, it's like trying to connect the dots between what's happening in crypto and, what's going on in the wider economy, like all this stuff with President Trump and tariffs and China firing back.
It's like all these things that you wouldn't think are connected, but they kind of are.
Yeah, and then you see Bitcoin's price taking a hit and you're like, what's going on here? So that's exactly what we're going to dig into today,
Yeah,
right?
we're going to break it down.
For sure. So it's Friday, April 4th, 2025, and we're looking at all this crazy stuff happening between crypto and global trade and even the stock market.
Yeah, they all seem like separate worlds, but suddenly they're all kind of reacting to the same global events.
It's wild, right? So our goal today is to walk you through what's happening and why, and we've got some great articles to help us do just that.
Yeah, for sure.
We've got a couple from the Globe and Mail, 3 important numbers to know for Bitcoin investors. That's a good one. And then Bitcoin price falls below $82,000. Crypto stocks slide after tariff plans. So that's kind of where we're starting today.
Right.
We've also got one from Barron's, Bitcoin XRP. Other crypto prices are under pressure, how far they could fall. Kind of a scary title.
Yeah, a little ominous.
And then from Forbes, we've got China triggers sudden Bitcoin price crisis scenario fear. So, buckle up, right?
Yeah, it's going to be a ride.
So basically, we want you to come away from this with a better understanding of why these events are happening and what they might mean for all of us.
Exactly. We want to connect those dots for you.
All right, so let's jump right in. Let's start with these new tariffs. What did President Trump actually announce, and how did that impact the crypto world?
Well, basically what happened is President Trump decided to increase tariffs, and that seems to have spooked investors. Vicky J. Huang over the Globe and Mail reported on this.
Okay, so what does that mean for crypto? Like, why would that affect Bitcoin?
Right, so when you see these kind of moves from governments, it creates uncertainty. Right, like nobody's quite sure what's going to happen next. And when investors get nervous, they tend to pull back from riskier assets.
And crypto's still seen as pretty risky, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why you saw that almost immediate reaction in the market.
Yeah, Bitcoin dropped below $82,000. That was a big deal.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Bitcoin, Ether, and XRP. They took an even bigger hit percentage-wise.
Why is that? Why would they drop even more than Bitcoin?
Well, Bitcoin is kind of the big dog in crypto, right? It's the most established and tends to be a bit more stable. But those smaller cryptocurrencies, they're a lot more volatile. So when there's a shock to the system, they tend to swing more dramatically.
Makes sense. So it's like the whole market is kind of panicking and those smaller coins get hit even harder.
Right. And it wasn't just the cryptocurrencies themselves. Even stocks of companies tied to the crypto world took a big hit too.
Yeah, I remember seeing that Coinbase and MicroStrategy, I think they were down like 10% and 8%.
Exactly. Those kinds of drops in a single day are definitely something to pay attention to. Yeah, that's a big move. And I guess it makes sense, right? Those companies are so closely tied to the health of the crypto market.
Yeah, they're seen as kind of a barometer. So when there's negative sentiment around crypto, their stock prices tend to follow suit.
And if you look at the bigger picture, it wasn't just crypto freaking out, right? The whole market was having a bad day.
Oh yeah. Barron's pointed out that the S&P 500 had its worst day in like 5 years after those tariff announcements.
Wow. So this wasn't just a crypto thing. It was a much broader reaction to these trade tensions.
Yeah, for sure.
And I guess it makes sense when you think about it, right? Tariffs can really mess things up.
Oh yeah, for sure.
They disrupt supply chains. They can make it more expensive for businesses to operate. And that can ultimately slow down the entire economy.
Exactly. And then, of course, you've got China hitting back with their own tariffs.
Right. 34% on all U.S. goods starting April 10th. I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, that's not messing around. That's a pretty strong response. And that kind of escalation is what really makes markets nervous, right?
Oh, yeah. Markets hate uncertainty. And when you have these two huge economies going head-to-head, it creates a lot of unknowns.
So even though crypto is supposed to be decentralized, it still gets caught up in all this global economic drama.
Yeah, it's not immune to those wider anxieties.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Globe and Mail had this interesting article about Boeing.
Okay, how does Boeing fit into all this?
Well, it's not directly about crypto, but it shows how tariffs can have real-world consequences for companies.
Right, like hurting their bottom line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The article talked about how tariffs can make companies less competitive, increase their costs, and disrupt their supply chains.
Right. So even though it's not about crypto, it kind of shows how everything is connected.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good illustration of how these high-level policy decisions can have ripple effects across different sectors.
All right, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about Bitcoin specifically. After President Trump was elected, Bitcoin actually rallied quite a bit.
Yeah, that's right. There was a lot of optimism at the time.
And part of that was because people thought he was going to be good for crypto, right?
Yeah, there was this perception that he was pro-crypto and that we might see a more favorable regulatory environment.
But now it seems like things are going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it definitely feels like we've done a 180.
So what happened?
Well, as we've been talking about, these trade tensions are creating a lot of uncertainty, and that's putting downward pressure on risk assets like Bitcoin.
And the Globe and Mail pointed out that Bitcoin had its worst first quarter performance since 2018.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. It shows that the market sentiment has really shifted.
So what's the outlook now? Where do people think Bitcoin is headed?
Well, it's interesting because you have these very different perspectives. The Globe and Mail talked about some pretty ambitious long-term predictions.
Like Bitcoin reaching $1 million by 2030.
Yeah, or even $1.5 million like Kathy Wood has suggested. That's a pretty bold prediction.
I mean, it sounds crazy, but when you look at Bitcoin's historical performance, it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility, right?
Well, yeah. The Globe and Mail mentioned that Bitcoin had a 125% jump in 2024 alone. And if you look at the annualized return between 2011 and 2021, it was a whopping 230%.
I mean, those are the kind of numbers that make you want to go all in.
Right. But it's important to remember that past performance doesn't guarantee future results.
Yes.
Especially in a market as volatile as crypto.
Right. So those long-term predictions are exciting, but we got to be realistic too.
Exactly. And when you look at the near term, the current trade situation is creating a lot of uncertainty.
So what are the short-term predictions looking like?
Well, Barron's highlighted some more cautious predictions. For example, Jin, the COO of MEXC, suggested that Bitcoin might end April somewhere between $76,000 and $78,000.
Okay, so still pretty high, but a definite drop from where it was.
Yeah, and he even said it could drop as low as $52,000 to $56,000 over the summer.
Wow, that's a pretty big potential downside.
Yeah, it shows how worried people are about these trade disputes and how they might impact the global economy.
And then Forbes talked about this crisis scenario fear.
Yeah, they quoted Sergei Gorev from UHudler, who's basically saying that these retaliatory tariffs from China could have a really severe impact on risk assets.
So it's like a worst-case scenario where things spiral out of control.
Right, and in that scenario, Bitcoin would definitely take a hit.
So as an investor, it's kind of hard to know what to make of all this, right? You've got these long-term predictions that are super bullish, but then the short-term outlook is much more uncertain.
Yeah, it's a tough call. It really depends on your risk tolerance and your investment timeline.
So let's talk about some of the specific things that investors should be paying attention to. The Globe and Mail highlighted a few key metrics that I think are really interesting.
Okay, let's hear them.
One of the biggest ones is the fact that $100 billion has flowed into spot Bitcoin ETFs since they launched in January 2024.
Yeah, that's a huge number.
Yeah.
It shows that traditional investors are really starting to embrace Bitcoin.
And these ETFs have been incredibly successful.
Oh, yeah. The Globe and Mail said they're some of the most successful new financial products in recent history.
And I think that's because they offer a more regulated and accessible way for people to invest in Bitcoin, right?
Exactly. You don't have to worry about setting up a crypto wallet or dealing with exchanges. It's all handled through your regular brokerage account.
And it seems like the iShares Bitcoin Trust from BlackRock is the most popular one.
Yeah, they've got a staggering $50 billion in investment.
That's insane. And they even surpassed BlackRock's own gold ETF in terms of invested capital.
Yeah, that shows you how much demand there is for Bitcoin right now.
And the flow of money into these ETFs has become a key indicator for Bitcoin watchers, right?
Yeah, when you see inflows, it's a good sign.
Yeah.
It suggests that demand is increasing and that could push the price up.
But when there are outflows, it can signal that people are losing interest.
Right. And during that whole tariff drama, we saw 5 straight weeks of outflows from Bitcoin ETFs.
Wow, so it's like people were getting spooked and pulling their money out.
Exactly. It's a real-time gauge of investor sentiment.
And it's not just the flow of money. It's the sheer size of these ETF holdings that's mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah. The Globe and Mail pointed out that the iShares Bitcoin Trust now holds more Bitcoin than any country.
Even more than the U.S. government.
Yep, and more than MicroStrategy, which was the biggest corporate holder.
That's crazy. So a huge chunk of the Bitcoin supply is now held in these ETFs.
It really highlights the growing influence of institutional investors in the Bitcoin market.
Okay, so another key metric is Bitcoin's market capitalization, which basically tells you the total value of all the Bitcoin in circulation.
Right, and it peaked at $2 trillion back in January when Bitcoin hit $109,000.
But with the recent price drop, it's now sitting around $1.7 trillion.
Yeah, but that's still a massive amount of money.
And to put that in perspective, that puts Bitcoin in the same league as some of the biggest tech companies in the world.
Exactly. Like Amazon and Alphabet. It shows you how Bitcoin is becoming a major player in the global financial system.
And speaking of tech companies, there's this interesting idea that Standard Chartered put forward. They're basically saying that we should start thinking about Bitcoin more like a tech stock than a traditional cryptocurrency.
Okay, that's interesting. Why do they say that?
Well, they're pointing out that Bitcoin's price movements are increasingly correlated with the tech sector.
So what does that mean for investors?
Well, it means that the same factors that drive tech stock valuations are also starting to influence Bitcoin.
So things like interest rates, inflation, and overall economic growth.
Exactly. And there's this idea of the Magnificent 7B where they're replacing Tesla with Bitcoin in that group of top-performing tech stocks.
So it's like Bitcoin is being seen as part of that tech elite.
Right, and I think it's a really interesting shift in perspective because it suggests that Bitcoin is becoming more integrated into the mainstream financial world.
Yeah, it's not just this fringe asset anymore. It's becoming a legitimate investment option for a wider range of investors.
So looking ahead, what are some of the key takeaways for investors?
Well, the biggest one is that we should expect continued volatility in the near term.
Yeah, Forbes quoted Javier Rodriguez Alarcon from XBTO, who said that the uncertainty surrounding these tariffs is likely to keep the markets on edge.
Right, so buckle up because it's going to be a bumpy ride.
And the general advice seems to be to err on the side of caution.
Yeah, Forbes stressed the importance of monitoring key economic indicators like inflation data and economic growth figures.
And they also said to be careful with position sizes and to avoid using too much leverage.
Right. It's all about protecting your capital during times of uncertainty.
And ultimately, the performance of Bitcoin and the crypto market as a whole is going to depend on global risk sentiment.
Yeah, if investors are feeling nervous about the economy, they're going to be less likely to invest in risky assets like crypto.
So it's all connected, right?
Exactly. What happens in the wider world impacts crypto and vice versa.
Okay, so to sum it all up for you, today's discussion has really highlighted how the crypto market, and especially Bitcoin, is operating within this complex web of global trade tensions reactions in traditional financial markets and its own unique dynamics.
It's like a three-dimensional chess game.
Exactly. And President Trump's tariff announcements and China's response have thrown a big wrench into the works.
Yeah, they've created a lot of volatility and uncertainty.
And while the long-term outlook for Bitcoin is still positive thanks to things like increasing adoption and the success of spot ETFs, the short-term picture is much murkier.
Right. It all hinges on how these trade tensions play out and how investors react to them.
So it's a time to stay informed and to carefully consider all these interconnected factors when you're making investment decisions.
And to remember that even decentralized assets like Bitcoin are not immune to what's happening in the global economy.
So we encourage you to keep learning and to stay up to date on all the latest developments.
And to form your own informed opinions based on the information you gather.
All right, that's it for today. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications.